Greetings and welcome to In-Depth. I'm Dike Rostant. We continue a conversation that we would have started with clinical and community psychologist Charles J.P. Collier about school violence. Thank you so much for returning for part two of this conversation, Mr. Collier.
Thank you for
Just
having me.
before we ended the first one, you were giving us a breakdown. You actually started to go into neurobiology. I'm
Yes,
not sure if there's anything that you want to wrap up on that side before we continue going into looking at the basis for some of the violence
very
that
much
we
so.
see.
Very, very much so. So
Thank you.
the neurobiology is really important because it is built into us. The response of being startled by threats, the response of fleeing from threats, becoming anxious, the response of trying to fight off threats, becoming aggressive or violent, and the response of collapsing or shutting down in response to threats. All of these are biologically driven. They're built into us, they're hardwired into us. And so we can be anywhere on the spectrum depending on the circumstances and conditions. Any one of us can have any of these responses or all of them. Um, that connects to the thing that is the big driver across board of violence, which is trauma. Um, it's a term that gets thrown around a lot, and it's not well articulated. It's different people have different ways of talking about it, and it can be very confusing. The way that I have found it useful to talk about it is that trauma is what happens when we have something that we don't want happen. It's an unwanted experience, and we're unable to control it. It's uncontrollable. So we can't stop it, prevent it, limit it, avoid it, defer it, delay it. It's just happening, though it's something that we don't want. And so those are sort of external to us. Internally, what happens is that we have a reaction, a response that rests in that same part of the brain that is that same response system to threats of anxiety and anger and shutdown, collapse, depression, right? All of those are responses, among others, to an unwanted and uncontrollable experience. And if the intensity and the sheer number of emotions that we're experiencing gets high enough, we get to a point where whatever ways we have of coping are no longer sufficient. We're overwhelmed. Trini would say something like, boy, I had a breakdown. We get to the place where we just can't cope with things, at least based on the way that we have learned how to cope up until that point. That's when it becomes a traumatic experience. And we respond to traumatic experiences in a variety of ways that correspond to the elements, if you will, of trauma. We respond to the fact that it's an unwanted experience with avoidance. We try to avoid it, escape it, get away from it. We respond to the fact that it's uncontrollable by trying to establish control. And we respond to the fact that it's an overwhelming emotional experience by trying to find different ways to manage our emotions. Um, Many of the things that we do are not healthy, or at least they're double-edged swords. So avoidance, for example, we might avoid something for a while, but then it happens when we're not planning or expecting, and so we're traumatized all over again. We try to establish control, but we are limited, we're finite, and we can't control everything. And there comes a point when we can't control things. And if that's how we've been coping, we're traumatized all over again. In Trinidad and Tobago, we make great use of emotion management in the form of substance use. Um, Very common thing. Mr. Killer had this song some years ago that had everybody picking up things and running with them. And in it, he gives what I jokingly call the Caribbean man's mental health diagnosis, prescription, and efficacy study. It begins this way. I had some stress, so I take some shots. The amount I take, it really hit the spot. That is, to a large extent, how we cope. When we're not doing that, we often resort to compulsive behaviors. So we'll, you know, binge television shows, or we're on these devices all day, every day, or we fetting in every fet. We had to go to every line. We have to be in everything, or we work. We have to stay busy all the time. Um,
And that makes me
all
want
of
to ask, can some people afford to deal with their trauma more than others? And I say that
Absolutely.
because there's some people who say, all right, well, I go pray it away
Mm,
and lay my burdens down by the Savior side.
mm,
Some people will look at self-medication, be it like
yeah,
Mr. Killer or the in terms of having those shots or consuming content like you just binge watch. Some people just work because I because sometimes people tell somebody you real strong boy. If that was me, and but it's not necessarily strength as opposed to the person not necessarily seeing another way. You
right.
don't have the opportunity to not deal because these responsibilities, they have these dependents, and they're counting on you to be able to function. Dealing with that traumatic experience is going to incapacitate you from functioning at that point in time, and that is not an option.
And so what happens is that people, we often continue on using these various mechanisms, these means and methods, and some of them are more socially acceptable than others. And so in our society, if somebody is constantly working, we might think that they're really ambitious. They might be traumatized. Um, we might see somebody who, they're very religious. And I have nothing against religion. I'm a deeply religious person myself. Um, but sometimes it's being used as a way to escape the reality of our lives. Um, and so the issue isn't so much whether people can afford, it's whether people have access to things that they can do that are beneficial, that are helpful, ways of coping, and that do not come with unwanted costs and consequences. Um, the reason that I'm talking about trauma is because under the subheading of control as means of coping with trauma, we try to control our environments, we try to control ourselves, we also try to control other people. That's where violence comes into play. It might come in the form of people pleasing, where we're very, super nice and sweet to everybody, because we're trying to get everybody to like us, because that's how we learned how to stay safe in childhood, or how we learned to have any of our needs met in childhood. But we might also use more antisocial kinds of behaviors like deception or manipulation. We might go all the way up to coercion, where we're holding something over somebody's head. But in Trinidad and Tobago, very often we also engage in very unsophisticated violence, where we are exerting force to make someone else do what we want or not do what we don't want. And so when we look at school violence, it's reasonable to think that we are, to a large extent, looking at the outcomes of trauma.
And we're going to let that breathe for a moment and take a short break. And when we return, we continue with the conversation. We are speaking with clinical and community psychologist Charles J.P. Collier. Stay with us. We return after this. Welcome back. I don't know if we should call it violence in schools or trauma in schools or trauma in the community that is manifesting in schools. we let the viewers be the judge, but we're having a conversation with Charles J.P. Collier, clinical and community psychologist, and trauma expressed as unsophisticated violence. Do we start to treat that with the individuals? Do we start to treat that with the wider circles that those individuals operate in?
So as a matter of perspective, um, we are a trauma-soaked nation and region. Um, we are, most of us here, as a result of violence committed against our ancestors. We are the descendants of people who were captured, stolen from their lands, enslaved, raped, beaten. We reside on land that was stolen from the indigenous people who were virtually eradicated by genocidal action. We are the descendants of people whose lands were invaded and whose social divisions were used to force them into positions of vulnerability, making indentureship seem like a way out, to then be exploited um, here. And so historically, this has been a violent place. And we've had lots of violent expression for a very long time. And the violence of economic oppression, of um, exploitation, of enslavement, of indentureship, gets handed down in multiple ways. We came to independence, and that's a wonderful thing. However, the structures that were built and created and put in place to sustain exploitation and to sustain the violence of colonization, um, those structures weren't removed. They weren't changed. We got people who look like you and me now occupying the same positions of higher and lower power within that structure. And the thing about a system is that it produces the same outcomes regardless of who's in it. And so we're still dealing with the same traumatizing systems. We're still dealing with the traumatizing history. I'm not going to try to get into the business of epigenetics, but what happens is that it turns out that trauma causes genetic changes, resulting in the expression of problems arising from the trauma in multiple generations after those who have been traumatized. And so here we are with the same, fundamentally the same colonial school system, where getting into a high school, for example, continues to be the Hunger Games, where you have insufficient places to schools that are literally called prestige schools, indicating the social hierarchy that was imposed upon us is retained. That's the system that we're in. And I'm putting that on the table because if we don't deal with that history and we don't deal with the system, we end up putting various bandages on broken limbs. And so I don't want to come away from the conversation with the idea that the responsibility and the major issue is to identify this individual who has been violent and fix them. That's not the problem. That is certainly an outcome, but it's not primarily the problem. We have built-in inequities so that there are communities right within the Port of Spain area that do not have running water, that do not have reliable access to electricity. There are things like that that exist in our society, and those are forms of violence. Those inequities are forms of violence, and people are very well aware of it. There's a Jamaican proverb, an expression that says, who feels it knows it. And there are lots of people who feel it, and our children are the most vulnerable and they feel it the most. And so the people who are most likely to be traumatized in our society are our children. And so if they end up acting out violence in schools, That's something that we as a society have to address, that there are things within our society that have to be addressed, that intervention has to happen at the level of economic equality, opportunity, and access. Intervention has to happen at the level of the meeting of fundamental needs for everyone. Notwithstanding that, we have within our school systems patterns of violence that are sustained. We have a hierarchical system, and we have histories of violence in schools. When I was going to school, we had lots of violence. Um, and as a general rule, there wasn't a lot of intervention by teachers or other school officials. I don't think that's changed very much. And as we have progressed as a society, becoming more and more violent, the development of what functionally, in many ways, is a narco state, the proliferation of firearms, there's been a proliferation of violence within communities. We have one of the highest rates of murder in the region. All of those things are happening, and our children are experiencing, witnessing, and being exposed to all of it, and they're being traumatized by it. That they act out violently is not surprising. And so
We're looking
those
at
are
the fact that
things.
systemic change
Mhm.
is something that doesn't happen overnight. Where do we
Agreed.
start?
First, by talking about it and telling the truth about it. Um, the Trinidadian expression, plain talk, bad manners, um, I think is a colonial thing that was left over. It was a way of preventing the people who suffered the most within an oppressive system from saying that it's an oppressive system, because those who were benefiting from it didn't want to be told. I think that remains true. And I think, therefore, that at a system level, as at an individual level in therapy, the first step towards change is telling the truth. Um, I do think that there are broader things that can be done to reduce school violence. Um, but separate and apart from the larger systemic issues, there are things that can be done at the level of the community. Um, Again, there's a need for significant support to do that. If, for example, a community is faced with a pattern of gang violence, members of the community can act, but they cannot act alone in addressing that. Um, and if there's a pattern of gang violence, there's a need to ask why. Is gang violence able to have a hold in that community in that way? Are there barriers to other forms of um, success, of acquisition of material goods? Are there other ways? And if there are barriers that are in place, how can those be removed? And that may not just be a question of the community's responses. Um, I've had conversations with people who live in areas that have been stigmatized, who have told me plainly that they don't tell the truth about their address. They've worked hard, they've gone to school, they've acquired different academic accomplishments and attainments and accolades and so on. And they're trying to get a job, and they have to put a different address, because if they put their address, they will be discriminated against. We have to address those things. We have to deal with those things. We also need to have, at a community level, alternative things for our young people to do. There are organizations like the police youth clubs, for example, that are engaged in attempting to do that, but there needs to be a great deal more of that. I think that there's a need to address how we approach education at all. Um, the fact that we have children 9 years old developing anxiety disorders because they have to prepare for common entrance, to get a place in a school, to have their future be determined at that point, is if you want to talk about what is mad and not mad, that is madness. And as long as we sustain a system like that, we also make it difficult for children to live lives that are rewarding and fulfilling and that allow them to have release from the stresses and the things that they face because they have to spend all their time from an early age studying constantly.
And
Um,
you've spoken about time, and once again we had that hard marker. But and I think you're turning me into Oliver Twist. So hopefully we have another conversation in the not too distant future, Mr. Collier.
I
But
look forward to it.
Charles J.P. Collier, clinical and community psychologist, and I didn't want to drop this seed, but I'm planting it for our next conversation because
Mm-hmm.
Joseph Remy, he speaks to the distinction of homes and communities versus houses and areas. So even like
Mm.
looking at
Mm.
what are the parameters that say, okay, well, this is a community versus an area. Hopefully, that's one of the things we can get into next time we speak. But this has been in depth, and on behalf of the entire crew at TTT, thank you so much. I'm DK Rostar. Thank you so much for joining.